All right, so today we're going to talk about student-driven design, and we're going to look at some ways that you can begin to implement some basic ideas into your room and kind of delve deeper into those as you go. So why student-driven design? Students are not all on the same page just because they're in the same grade or the same age. They have different interests and motivations, but more than that, it teaches students to set their own goals, gives them room to make mistakes and fail forward, learning from missteps, develops critical thinking and self-reflection skills, and pushes students to self-advocate. It teaches to the whole child and prepares them for the world they are entering. It will increase your engagement from students and lessen your workload once you make it regular practice. So ideas on where to start that will actually lessen your workload. Students can design their own rubrics. Students track their progress and self-assess and self-pace. Students choose how to reach a specific goal and prove how they've already mastered it. Students work during class time to design lessons that help them understand what is being taught and how. Students get feedback on your teaching, which helps you grow and teaches them how to use feedback. It takes some trust, but it's totally worth it. Students communicate with families. Students can write your subplans. So let's take a look first at that student-created rubrics. We're going to look at two different ways that you can do this. I know the traditional rubric model kind of has those blocks, and it starts with basic and moves up to proficient. We've changed that to a more student-friendly format in my room, and it works beautifully. So my students in this are working on a student-driven project that's cross-content, and they have created their mastery checklists for each area we're working on. So the two we're looking at here is the research presentation portion and the science portion. And so they get to mark if they're still working on it, or they get to initial that they can prove that they've got it, and then they need to do just that. They need to prove it to me that they've got it. So in this, they listed out under research. I can research using multiple sources. I can cite my sources. I can share my research effectively without copywriting. I can work with teammates, and I can create a Google site. And then I've then linked those to standards that we're working on in the gradebook, but they're able to come up to me at any point they have these mastered and use evidence to show me that they've done it. The other way that we've done these types of student-created rubrics is I've given my students the standards. We've listed them out together. And again, they're marking if they're working on it or if they can prove that they can understand it. So in our math unit, these are all the topics that are required for fourth grade fractions. And as my students master it, then they're able to self-pace through it. They're able to self-evaluate themselves. They're able to tell me when they have done it. And this is the checklist that they gave that we created together based off of that idea from students. So taking a look at this, is this something that would work in your world? What style would you choose? And what activities could you start using this in? So looking at a student designed lesson. So one of my favorite things about kids is that they ask questions. And so in our classroom, we read a novel that had dragons in it. My students wrote persuasive essays asking if we could get a class pet, wanting a dragon. We ended up adopting 2 crested geckos. From that, they wanted to know if those geckos would have babies. And in that basic conversation, we had an entire life cycle habitat unit that was built. So we started with students writing a persuasive essay on the 5 different animals that we have in our room. So we hatch chickens in our room, and I have a chicken farm, so we bring those in repeatedly. We have stick bugs. We now have mini dragons, which are crested geckos. We have leopard geckos and fire-bellied toads. And the students wanted to know if these animals would have babies. And so from that, we did our essays first, and we broke down how that would look and what it would look like. And then we created an outline for a giant project. Write your essay, choose your group. Not just that they would be in a group, but whether they wanted to work in a group or independently and why. Conduct science background research using multiple academic sources. Collaboratively create a Google site. That's how they wanted to share their knowledge. Learn the scientific method. Create a plan for an experiment because they are actually going to attempt to breed these animals in our classroom. Engineering design habitats that would allow for that to happen, because traditional tanks don't necessarily meet the same adaptations and needs of animals when they're in that stage that they're going to be breeding. Conduct the actual experiment of whether or not the breeding rates in our habitats would exceed that of wild animals, and then collaboratively continue that Google site to share their experiment and data, and then present that in a citizen science project. So this is completely designed by students. And then they brainstormed ways that they could work in their teams. They outlined together what sources they could use for their background research. We realized that we weren't digging deep enough. So as a group, they sat down and they brainstormed what would they need to do to deepen their life cycle research, their diet research, their habitat research. And we're still getting to the point that we're brainstorming those adaptations. Each individual group had their specific checklist with questions that they had done. They created their piece for topic research as they did it. They got to their Google site checklist, what they needed to include on that. And as this project continues down through the scientific method, they worked on it together. They got to those mastery checklists that we talked about. So thinking about that, we're taking a look at if an idea like a big project like this might work in your world. Are there questions that your students have that could start a unit like this? Are there concerns that you have in starting something big like this? And what are those concerns? And how could you work with other teammates or other teachers to help problem solve some of those concerns? This project that my kids undertook, not only did they completely design it, not only do they understand what they're working on and why, it crosses all their content areas. So they have to work within a budget, so they're working with specific math standards. They have to conduct a scientific experiment working through each step in the process. They have to do an entire research project for background research on their animals and the adaptations for it. So they're writing, they're reading, they're doing science, they're doing math, they're engineering, because they're building habitats. And all of these different components being done over the quarter allow them to hit all those standards across the board, but it was designed and driven by them. So they're completely motivated in that. At the end of this presentation, I will link videos where you can actually listen to their conversations and see their Google site and where they're working. So the next thing then would be taking feedback from students. Use your writing block to receive feedback from students that will impact your instruction. Ideas for ways to do this. Ask students to explain what their favorite subject or activity is and why. Follow that up with having them explain two that they don't like or like less and why. This will give you insight into your teaching, and if you're transparent, open, it will let them know you will use their ideas to change instruction. Ask students to propose ideas if they were to take over the class. So let's take a look at some examples. When we look at this particular student who wrote their paper, they're writing in a really non-traditional format. And one of the things that I love about it is they're actually writing about art, and they're talking about why they love art class. And so in this, he gets going and he says, cliffhanger. And he says, okay. I know I'm not supposed to do stuff like that, and I'm trying to be serious, but I just had to do a cliffhanger. It's my way of being artsy in my writing. And so this particular student is not only telling me that they like art in class and that they like different ways of expressing themselves, but when they go on in their paper, they tell me that they like the different subjects, but talk about why some of them aren't working. And they identify things that I wouldn't have known. This particular student has gross motor difficulties because he gets hand cramps when he's writing. And his neck hurts because he looks down for too long because it takes him so long to write. So then looking for strategies to help him specifically is something that I'm able to do from the feedback he's giving to me on why he isn't liking writing. In this particular example, I have a student that is explaining to me reasons that math, now this is an advanced math student, reasons that math aren't a good fit for him is because he feels like it applies pressure. If he doesn't do good enough, he's worried he might get a bad score. Another reason is if that he doesn't if he doesn't know how to do it, then he thinks that his parents will be in a foul mood because he's getting bad scores in school. And so it lets me know that there's a lot of grade anxiety in this student that I need to be aware of and mindful of, and then work in different ways to change how that's looking for him. This particular student chose to go a different route and actually asked me if they could teach a lesson on sign language. So as you read this paper, they're explaining why sign language is important in their world and why it's an important part of their life, and asking if they can teach it in the class, which absolutely is something that I'm open to. And this particular student then is teaching our class about sign language later in this quarter. This particular student is still working on that idea of a hook. This is a paper that they've met with me, and that's where we are at. But they're explaining why they like science. And again, they're giving me feedback that math isn't very fun for them unless we're playing Prodigy. And then they're explaining that things are tricky and complicated, and they don't like that feeling of not knowing something. They also let me know that while they love reading, they don't like me telling them what they need to read. They want something that they choose on their own. And so that's important feedback for me as I'm teaching, to know that they want to read what appeals to them. And so giving them that control is just going to help motivate them in staying positive in their own learning journey, because they want that freedom of choosing what they read. So is this something that would work in your world? Would writing work best? Or could you do this in one-on-one conferencing, where you just had a conversation with kids and brainstormed ideas about what they are looking for in learning, what they're not liking, what's not working, and why? Would it work better for your age group in a different way? So in communicating with families, we brainstorm with students how they can communicate with families and give the responsibility back to them. Consider student newspapers that they write quarterly, friendly letters to parents and asking parents to write back, or student-driven newsletters or videos reviewing their learning. So I know that I shared this the last time I shared my student newsletters. They actually make videos, take pictures, write up about what they're learning, and share with families. They also write to parents every Friday, telling them about what they did in the week, and parents write back to them. In this way, I've removed something from my plate. So would this work in your world? What style would you choose? What area or activity could you start using this in, where you gave that control back to your students to communicate with their families and put the onus back on them? All of these different ideas put the student in the driver's seat. They give them control in their classroom. They give them the means to choose, and they provide that intrinsic motivation that is really going to make them a self-resilient, self-advocating learner.